Welcome, everyone. Thank you for joining today's webinar on social media in emergencies. My name is Jeanette Lamb. I'm the Director of Impact Partnerships with the Cornerstone On Demand Foundation. Now, without further ado, I'd like to introduce you to today's guest speaker, Timo Luge, who is joining us from Berlin. A few words on his background. Timo is a communications and advocacy consultant who is working mainly for UN agencies, NGOs, and the Red Cross, Red Crescent movement. He's been working in the humanitarian sector for 7 years and was deployed to Haiti, Liberia, the Philippines, and Myanmar, in addition to spending time at headquarters. Among other things, Timo has written the social media staff guidelines for the International Federation of Red Cross and Red Crescent Societies and the UNICEF Social Media in Emergency Guidelines. Timo blogs at sm4good.com, and you can also find him at Twitter. Timo, thank you so much for sharing your expertise with us today. You have the floor.
Thanks, Jeanette. Thanks for inviting me, and I'm really, really glad to see, we already have like over 40 people joining this webinar. As Jeanette said, my name is Timo, and I'm really looking forward to going through my presentation with you today, and then afterwards also discussing with all of you a little bit like, how you can use social media for emergencies, for disaster response in general. I'd actually like to start with a little question to you. The question is, who's managing your organization's social media channel? And you should see, and for that I'm actually have to give back to Jeanette, you should see a little poll window coming up. And I'd like you to just, answer this question, then I'll come back to you like in a minute or two with the answer about like, who's managing your organization's social media channels? Is it the staff member? Is it, who's doing it in addition to his task? Is it a dedicated social media officer? Is it, one of your interns, an outside consultant or agency? Maybe you have no idea, or maybe you're not using social media. I'd be really interested in knowing that, and I'll get back to you like in a minute or two. To start the presentation, in addition to this, little query, I would like to look at like how has technology changed the way we interact with the world. And I'd like to share one image with you that I think shows this very nicely. This is the same event in 2005, and again the same event in 2013. Okay, maybe you didn't see that before. So what this image shows is the same event in 2005 and then again in 2013. The event you are seeing there is actually the election of the Pope, which obviously, happened in Rome, and which obviously is a highly developed country. But I think still the difference you see in those two images is startling. Like in 2005, you see, if you look closely, you can see like 2 or 3 mobile phones in there. In 2013, you could basically light the whole place with the screens of the mobile phone. Now, at the moment, there are about 6.8 billion mobile phone subscriptions in the world, and 2.3 billion mobile internet subscriptions. If you're wondering, like, why is he talking about mobile phones now? And, isn't this about social media? Yes, but the two of them are linked. Social media wouldn't be what it is if it wasn't also mobile. And what is interesting about that number of 2.3 billion mobile internet subscriptions is that more than half of them are actually in developing countries. Now, of course, a lot of times, when we look at mobile internet use in countries that are affected by emergencies or by disasters, it's not about what we saw on St. Peter's Square, where people have like, a fancy iPhone or like a nice smartphone or anything like that. But a lot of times, mobile internet looks very much like this. Somebody who has, a computer hooked up to, a car battery or a solar panel or something like that, and has a USB feed through which you can connect to the internet like very, very slowly. And I think when talking about social media in emergencies, we need to be aware that most of our use cases will take place in situations that look like the slide you're seeing at the moment, and not so much in situations that we saw in St. Peter's Square. Going through the presentation, I'm going to talk about 4 different ways that I think social media can play a role in emergencies. The first is to share information. The second is to collect information. The third is to divide big tasks into smaller tasks. And the fourth is to help coordinate help by the affected population for the affected population. Now, again, I'd like to emphasize that it's called social media because, you know, having a Facebook or a Twitter account does not mean you have social media. A lot of times I see people just saying like, oh, you know, yes, we do social media, we are on Facebook. But, you know, just having that account is not actually, you know, what means that you're actually doing it well. Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, all of these are only communication channels. And if you really want to do social media communication, you have to open yourself up to conversation that goes in multiple directions. It's not about you just posting, you know, your press releases on Twitter or putting something out on Facebook. It is about, you know, giving and taking, you know, talking and listening. So the social part of social media is something that I think is frequently being ignored or not being emphasized enough. With that, I would like to focus on the first part of the 4 items I wanted to discuss, which was the sharing of information. Now, you know, in an emergency, who's sharing information? Well, pretty much everybody, actually. You know, it's disaster management authorities, it's national and local government representatives, it's the media, NGOs, the Red Cross movement, UN, you name it. It's obviously also the local population, who is not on this slide, because for this part, I wanted to focus on like institutional communication. So, but, you know, long story short, a lot of people are talking. Now, let's look at, you know, what kind of information are they sharing? Now, sometimes you have things, you have recurring threats, like, you know, wildfires, hurricane season, these kind of things. Then very often what you have is you have organizations sharing things, you know, for disaster preparedness. This is an example from the CDC in the US about wildfires. You also, if it's an imminent threat, here's an example from the Philippines. You have disaster management authorities sharing information about like, okay, this is what is going to happen. You should be aware of it. Or another example from the Philippines. This isn't, you know, just telling people, oh, we are prepared. You know, this is what we are doing. This is kind of reassure people. Or you have, you know, other organizations who like post-disaster, you know, are trying to say like, oh, this is what we've done. So, you know, please be aware of, you know, what's happening. Of course, this very much is communication that is targeted, for example, at donors. And yeah, I have to say these examples, I'm coming back to that slide, they're very typical, and they have their place, and I think it's good to have them. But to be honest, I also think they're a little boring. They're still very much, you know, just pushing information out, and that's why I'd like to talk about the next example. And don't worry, we're also going to talk about, you know, examples from less developed context and not just in the US. This lovely lady there is Emily Rahimi. She's the social media manager of the New York Fire Department. And during Hurricane Sandy, she was sitting at her desk. Hurricane Sandy, you know, hit the east coast of the US and even hit New York. And, you know, she was sitting there and she was literally answering hundreds of questions with her. You know, she gave advice, she shared warnings, she connected people to emergency services, and she sat at and slept under her desk like for 30 hours during this emergency. So, you know, what she did as well was, you know, sharing information. What I showed you before was sharing information, but obviously it's a very different kind of sharing information. Clearly, this is far more personal, and this is also more meaningful to the people she's communicating with, because, you know, she's actually trying to connect, you know, with the people who are reaching out, or the people who are talking about, you know, the disaster that is happening as she is watching her social media feed. To get there, I think a few changes in how organizations communicate are essential. One of them is listening. You know, we're still too much just, as I said, like pushing out our press releases without listening. That means we have to go from an idea of public information to public communication. It's only communication if both people talk. And I think it's also really important that you don't hide behind the logo that it is human, which is a lot of organizational Twitter accounts in particular, or Facebook pages. They're very, very institutional and a little bit dry. And it's quite interesting to see there are a number of organizations who really empower their staff to speak publicly so that they can, from wherever they are based, they talk about like what they are seeing and what they are doing, rather than just having the organization push out information. But this is something that the organization has to be comfortable with, and it's important that you actively empower your staff to do that. And before we're going to the next slide, I'm actually going to now share the results of the poll. I asked you who's managing your organization's, oops, where is it? Something's happening to my screen. I was asking who's managing your organization's social media channels. And a second ago, I saw the results of that, and now I see them again. And the answers were that, okay, I have to open this a little bit to see this better. I'm not sure whether you, ooh, okay. There are things happening to my screen which you can't see. That's why I'm making these funny noises. Basically, 36% of you said that the staff is managing your social media presence in addition to the regular duties. 26% said it's a dedicated social media officer, which is quite encouraging, and 4% said it's one of the interns. Now, the reason I was asking that question was because I want to show you what can happen if you give social media, the control of the institutional social media channels to people who don't really know what they're doing. This is an example from last week that I just put in there. In this case, this was a tweet by Amnesty International that was criticizing policing in the U.S. And then a think tank in the U.S. responded to that with, "Your work has saved far fewer lives than American intervention." So this is an example of, what happens if somebody has control over your institutional account who probably shouldn't have control over your account. This is what I mean, don't let your intern do it. So, have a framework in place. Of course, afterwards, very quickly they said like, oh, we're really sorry. This was sent in error. We're reviewing our internal policies, but the damage was done. So I'm also sharing this example, not just to say like, think about like who has access to your social media account, but also to say like, well, a lot of people are worried, that staff might be doing things, on social media that's harmful. In my experience, that very, very, very rarely happens. But the same people have no problems with like handing over control over their social media channels to an intern. That doesn't make sense. You have to. The key to this is, to give people guidance what to do so that they can communicate in the way that you want them to communicate. Yeah. And with that, I actually come to the second poll, because in order for people to, competently use social media and to be comfortable using social media when it's work-related, I think you really need some kind of guidelines or a policy. So I would like to know from you whether you have guidelines or a policy for social media use of staff in the field. I'm using the field, but if you're a domestic, emergency response organization, obviously, the field can be 5 kilometers away from the office. So I'd really like to see the answer. A yes, no, or a don't know would be great. All right. Yeah. So what I'd like to raise as a question is: are staff a reputational risk or a public communication benefit? Because I think a lot of times, we're really a little afraid about like, oh, what are all these crazy people who are working for us, doing on social media? And, looking back a couple of years, if you had somebody like, this lovely guy who's a friend of mine in the field, if he was to say something, which he would never do, obviously, that, was not entirely appropriate, then nobody would hear it. But of course, today, he has probably even like, somewhere in a very remote part of wherever he's working, he's access to Facebook, LinkedIn, Twitter, Pinterest, Instagram, same as our local network. And so as communication professionals, we're sometimes, quite worried about that. and we shouldn't be. And I'm going to talk a little bit about, like, how to do it well, how to do it badly, and, what to keep in mind when empowering people in the organization to talk on behalf of the organization. I'd like to start with a bad example again, which is avoid this. For those of you who don't know who these lovely gentlemen are, they are invisible children. They work for invisible children, and they took this photo with soldiers. And of course, as everybody who is working in the humanitarian sector knows, this is not really the image you want. But the question I'd like to raise is this a social media problem? And I would say, no, it's not. It's a stupidity problem. A lot of times, we hear from people who say, like, oh, this is a big issue because, it's on social media. And I was like, no, it's an issue because people are not managed properly and people don't understand, their obligations to the organization or how to behave. That is not a social media problem. With that, I'd like to go to positive examples, which is, I'm sharing two, and they're both from UNHCR. This is from Andrew Harper, who's UNHCR rep in Jordan. And for example, he shared a while ago an update that we have no option but to succeed. But when we received 3,200 Syrian refugees in one night to Jordan with very little international support, it is tough. Now, this is very different from what you would normally see on organizational sympathy, because they are normally always saying, like, we are the best, we are the greatest, look at all the great things we are doing. What he is saying is, like, we're doing this job, but you know what? Last night was tough. And I think this is far more sympathetic in a way. This makes me engage far more and feel much more involved with what he's saying than, just like one of those glossy tweets. I'd like to share another example here, which is also from UNHCR. This was somebody who was working up in Jeddah in South Sudan, and she shared, this is Catherine Mahoney, she shared an update on Instagram of a plane that had crashed. And that plane had literally just crashed. And again, this is something we would normally not talk about, but I'm just going to read a little bit from how she described it, which is, a donkey was hit by the plane and died of his injuries later. My translator said of the crash, the donkey offered his soul to save the lives of the children who often play where the plane landed. I cannot explain the sense of relief and gratitude we all feel. Again, something has gone wrong. This is not a, we are doing great here, everything is working fine post. But it gives a very good sense of what's happening there. And I think, it gives you a feeling of, like, the people who are working there, they're working really hard, and they invite me to share their experience with them. Now, I'd like to share 4 key points for personal social media use with you. This is what I've written in a few organizations with their policies, and I think we can always have a few more, but I think, these are the essentials. One is, be passionate. And, and this is personal social media stuff, so this is use, so this is for staff. So please be passionate in your communication. The second is, think of CNN, your mom, and your boss. This is very important. If anything you post, you're comfortable with it showing up in CNN, if you're comfortable with your mom seeing it, if you're comfortable with your boss seeing it, then you can probably post it. If any of these you think, like, oh, I hope they don't see it, maybe you shouldn't. Ask yourself whether this can get someone into trouble, not just yourself. Yeah, and be careful with taking photos. Always ask for permission. I think this is super important. A lot of times we work with people who are very vulnerable. You might not realize that what you're doing might be published. So I think, yeah, we always have to ask for permission. It's an essential thing for me. With that, I'm coming on to the second thing. The second of my points, which was collecting information. Obviously, so far we talked about, like, sharing information. Now we're talking about what you do to collect information. I think there is something of an information paradox in this example, which is you have too much and too little information at the same time. Or you could say you have a lot of data, but not enough actionable information. Actionable is the key thing here. Now, how much is actually relevant? Because, a lot of people say, like, well, all people do on Instagram is, post photos of their lunch. but that is actually not correct, or at least it's not correct in a disaster. Somebody made a study a while ago and said that about 8% of tweets sent during disasters contain situational information. Now, what does that mean in numbers? After the earthquake and tsunami in Japan, for example, more than 100,000 tweets were posted every 5 minutes. After the 2011 New Zealand earthquake, 7,500 tweets were posted already with the hashtag NZEQ for earthquake. And after Typhoon Haiyan in the Philippines, 250,000 tweets were collected in 48 hours that already were situational relevant. Now, this is too much. Nobody can go through this like on his own. That's just, opening the floodgates of information, and you will drown within minutes, which means we need tools that help us identify relevant information and remove duplicates. One of the ways to do that is actually, you try to do that up front through things like, for example, unified hashtags. There's again an example of the Philippines. In case you're wondering, I was in the Philippines for 3 months, very good to hear. That's why I have a lot of examples of that. And they just said, very officially from the government, they said like, well, in future disasters, we would like you, dear users, to always use the same hashtag so that it's easier for us to know and to classify the information that you're sharing. For example, Rescue PH is for everything that is life-saving assistance. Relief PH is for needs like, blankets, water, these kind of things. And Save Now is so that you can close requests. As far as I know, this is the first time that a government has, has done this. But it's very interesting. And with that, I'm coming to the next point, which is dividing big tasks. Because, even if you do things like unified hashtags, you still have a very big task that you need to break into smaller pieces. And for that, I think we should do what we always do when we have a big task in disaster response, which is we just, share it among many people. And this time, we're actually using the internet to do it. I'm going to share 2 examples here. One is, again, from the Philippines, a standby task force. It's the standby task force of online volunteers. What they did is they had an automated system in place that, collected 250,000 tweets, then removed through an algorithm all the duplicates and stuff like that, so they were down to 55,000 tweets. And then they asked 120 volunteers, or they asked more volunteers, but 120 volunteers responded to help them, break those 55,000 tweets down to what is relevant. And I'm going to show you in the next slide what that looked like, but they used the so-called clicker system, which cut down these 55,000 to 18,000. And at the top of the activities, volunteers tagged about 150 tweets per minute. Now, just to show you what that would look like was, tweets were loaded into this interface where people then could say like, well, it's not relevant, or it's request for help, or it's infrastructure damage, or, whatever. This was used through a open source platform, and this was, done for free. Also, this was done on request of UN OCHA, which I think is very important, that this is not just something that people did because they hoped somebody would find it useful, but this was actually based on request. And oh, sorry, I'm just hearing you're losing me sometimes. That's not good. Okay. Where was I? Yes. So this was a request by UN OCHA, who were mainly interested in infrastructure damage. That's something that they wanted to map. And then the result of, the tweets that were collected there is this map. This was basically an immediate needs map that was created by the Standby Task Force based on tweets that were available immediately after Typhoon Haiyan, or Yolanda, how it's called in the Philippines. So as you can see, you could like zoom in and then, click on individual messages and see, what's going on there, like, are there images, can this inform my situational awareness? In total, only about 1,800 tweets were put on the map, which is 0.3% of the tweets harvested. Now, you could argue like, oh, well, isn't it a waste of time then, if it's so little? But no, it's not, because for one thing, you were able to outsource the task of identifying what's relevant to people who had spare time on their hands, which you probably didn't as a, somebody working in the middle of the emergency. And the other thing is, it is, in a way, yes, it's free information. And even if it's just 0.3%, it is relevant. And also, this was not all information that was available, but this was specific to the question, which tweets can inform us about infrastructure damage. So, other kinds of information was not mapped on this thing by UNOCHA. So that's just to keep in mind. This was very useful in the first days because something I never thought about, but when you have a big storm, you have a lot of clouds, and that means you can't get satellite images. So at least in the first period, having this information like from the ground is really useful because you don't have anything else. And it helped to create situational awareness, particularly from areas where the media was not present, like places like Tacloban. Everybody was there anyhow, so you knew it was bad. But like more remote areas, we just didn't know. Now, that leads me to a question about information bias, because a lot of times people are saying like, well, yeah, but where I work, people don't have access to social media, and it's true. Social media is not accessible in all locations and not to all members of the affected population, particularly the most vulnerable. So that's something to keep in mind. However, we found that, at least in some countries like the Philippines, mobile phones really work as a relay, which is to say, even people who have only a feature phone, so not a smartphone, will then frequently be able to get in touch with relatives who live elsewhere. I didn't explain that very well. Let's take a complete example. The affected area in the Philippines was very rural, and also a lot of people there were quite poor. They didn't have access to internet, but they all had, or many of them had, relatives who, for example, lived in Manila. Now, Manila was not affected by this disaster. So what they would do is they would text their relatives in Manila information about their situation, and then their relatives would post it on social media. And again, the relatives would look up information on the internet and would share that information back by SMS to their relatives. So the mobile phones work as a relay. I've also heard that from other places where that works quite well. A friend of mine told me that actually in Somalia, this way of communicating is actually quite interesting. And it also works very much not just for relatives, of course, in the country, but also with the diaspora, which we have to keep in mind. However, yes, it is biased, but biased information is better than no information, as long as you are aware of the bias. And I think we should also remember that traditional information gathering methods are also biased, because a lot of times if you want to know what's going on, you call your local office, which is probably like in a hub, and they will tell you what the situation is. So that's not really an unbiased view of information either. The second example I'd like to share is how remote mapping was used. Again, this is still to show how you can take social media and related technologies to break big tasks down into smaller tasks. The example I'd like to use here is actually the Ebola response in Guinea. Now, one of the organizations working there had a big problem, which was they didn't have maps. The whole area was not mapped, at least not significantly. Now, if you're looking at your screen and you think there's something wrong about your screen because you can't see anything, that is not your screen. What you see is the state of maps that were available for that area where that organization was working. They then sent a request out, again, to digital volunteers who sent the request out through social media to everybody else, and also through email to everything else. People came together and said, well, okay, let's help them map this. And within 14 hours, you had this map of the area. I'm just going to go back. So this was 10 a.m., and this was midnight. So this is what people managed to achieve once they were mobilized through social media. Of course, you need an interface through which they can map and all these kind of things, but, the mobilization was an important part because at the end of the day, if you can't mobilize people, they're not going to do anything. Yeah, as already said, volunteers were mobilized through social media and then created maps based on satellite images. They were coordinated through the humanitarian OpenStreetMap team. And what was also very important is there was staff in Guinea that was able to provide context to what the online volunteers had mapped. For example, from top, you might not see whether a building is a police station or a school or a hospital. So having these two things, I really don't want to say like, oh, this is all because social media is great. It's because social media is great when it can enhance the skills that are available locally, and when it can take over tasks that are either too big for people to do on their own, or when there are tasks that can very well be done somewhere else, in this case, remote mapping. But, providing context is what had to be locally. So it's the two things. It's not either or. With that, I'm coming to the fourth point, realizing running a little late, which is you can use social media to coordinate help for and by the affected population. I already said a lot of people, even if they don't have access to social media themselves, they can use social media indirectly, either through mobile phones of relatives or also through local media. Even in countries where people don't have access to social media, a lot of times local media will. What they do is, frequently share safe and well messages, just saying I'm okay, which is extremely important. Finding information, and because they want to know what's going on, and they're making decisions based on that, and coordinating resources to fulfill needs. So communities are themselves using social media to coordinate themselves to address their needs. I'm sharing an example here from Indonesia. This is from the UNOCHA report, Humanitarianism in the Networked Age. And it just shows briefly, in Indonesia, they have a volcano called Merapi that erupts frequently. And as you can see in 2006, they didn't have, social media and other network technologies. So what we had was very much, we did an assessment, and then the information was shared through the, media, and then it was the public, and that was that. A lot of people said that it wasn't very good, the information wasn't reliable, it was one-way communication, they weren't happy. In 2010, there was community radio, we had Facebook, Twitter, SMS, and all of that kind of thing. So at this time, when the assessment happened, people also shared their information in addition to the people doing the assessment through social media, which influenced the assessment. It allowed a circle of information. It allowed people doing the assessment to validate what they heard through secondary sources. And then, sorry, now I lost my thread because I was looking at the chat window. But, the other thing was also that because the information was dynamic, they were also able to address their own needs more quickly. One of the examples was that there was, people said, oh, we need food for 6,000 people. Somebody posted that, I think it was on Facebook or something, and then a radio station picked that up. They sent out somebody with a motorbike to verify that information. Then the radio station said, like, yes, we read on Facebook this community needs food for 6,000 people. And then another city that had, or another village that had these resources, actually sent them to that village. And this was within 30 minutes. And then they said, like, okay, food has arrived. And then the radio station could say, like, well, you don't need to send any more food to this village because it's all done. So this is a good way of seeing how, even in very remote areas, the combination between social media and traditional media can directly impact how the local community can respond and address their own needs. With that, I'm actually coming to my last slide, which is a little bit of a summary just of what I said, which is looking at the functions of social media. I think, there are three. One is it's a channel for information exchange. And this combines the first and the second point I made earlier, the sharing and the listening, because it's an information exchange social part. The second is it's a way to mobilize people. It can be physically, like in a space, bring food here, or it can be virtually, as we've seen with the example of mapping and of tagging those tweets. And it can be a tool to coordinate people, which is a little different from mobilize. And yeah, with that, I'm saying thank you, and I'm now looking forward to your questions, and which I know Jeanette has collected for me.
One question. Are there good examples of how social media can work with mainstream media to increase communication flow?
I think the example I just shared with Merapi is a good one. But actually, again, I'd like to think back to the Philippines. The Philippines has a website which is called, it's called Rappler. I'm just going to type the URL is rappler.com. And that's a very good, basically a mainstream media platform that it works in a very multimedia way. So by all means, if you have good social media content, and you should use traditional media to kind of give that more leverage.
Thank you. Another one we have here is the number of people we are reaching through Facebook has been going down. Should we pay to promote posts on Facebook?
I think it's worth doing. Facebook has deliberately reduced the number of people who actually see any of your updates. At the moment, I think, like 2 years ago, you could say that if you have 1,000 fans on Facebook, then about 160 of those would actually see your updates. So 2 years ago, about 16% of your actual fans would see your content. Today, that number is down to about 6. Facebook has done this deliberately to increase the ad buy. I found that by even promoting posts, or how it's called on Facebook, boosting posts, even if it's only like 2 or 5 euros for a post, the number of people you can suddenly reach goes up dramatically. So I realized that having a budget is always difficult. Having a budget for social media is difficult. Having a credit card that you can use is even more difficult. So I do realize there are organizational hurdles to that. But if you can, if you can find something like let's say you want to promote 5 posts per month, that would be like 25 euros or $25. You should try to do that just to see, how it changes the impact. Facebook is probably going to recommend you should spend like $120 on this. Don't do that. Do 4 or 5 and see what it does to you or for you.
Great, and I'm just going to pose 2 related questions to you. One is about what social media monitoring software do you use? And related to that, someone was asking, can you discuss the role of social network analysis in disaster response, and how can we use social network analysis to identify gaps in our information?
Okay, to answer the first one, I think this was the question from Melissa Stevens, who said, what do you do to aggregate all tweets you want to sort through during an emergency? Now, there are a couple of things. If you want to aggregate at a massive scale like what I showed, if it's like 250,000, then you need some kind of algorithm that does that. And for that, I would go to the Digital Humanitarian Network that I mentioned earlier. The Digital Humanitarian Network, they are basically an interface between you as an organization and tech people who know how to write algorithms. So, for example, I don't know how to do that, but there are plenty of people who do. So you just say, like, this is my need, and then they channel that in the right way. If you want to do it on a more micro level, so if it's really about social media monitoring, I still think, things like TweetDeck and so forth work really well. I'm also using a service called Mention. I think it's mention.net. I'm just going to post that, which I use as a social media monitoring tool. So that one is actually a paid tool. Oh, and I think I'm just being reminded that I forgot to resolve the question whether you have social media guidelines or not. 32% of you said that you have social media guidelines, and 33% said you don't, and 15% said you don't know, which means you probably don't have them. And yeah, this just goes back to the part where I was talking about, like, how can you improve your communication with your staff. And I think, it's quite encouraging that a third of the people on this call have social media guidelines for staff. And I'd really encourage the other 33 to do that. And there's so many good examples of good social media guidelines out there. And, just look at them, copy them, steal them, adjust them to your own needs. And it's really, really important because, as I said before, you as an organization, you can share, press releases and stuff like that. But it's not going to be as engaging as if your staff does it. And I just posted mention.net, the social media monitoring tool.
Great. Thank you, Timo. Another question, should NGOs have separate Twitter accounts for different departments? For example, the emergency, development, advocacy work, or should we tweet everything from one account?
Oh, yeah, that's a tricky one. I'm starting to be a fan of a slightly different model, which is one organizational account, and then not go down to departments, but then go down to people. This is the American Red Cross is doing that, for example, or also I've seen a number of police forces who do that, who basically say, like, well, our staff are the subject matter experts, so we're going to find the 10, 15 people within the organization who actually really like social media, and we're going to, ask them to use social media accounts to talk about their work. So, for example, if there's an emergency and you are driving a bus that is a soup kitchen or something like that, then what you're doing is, you encourage the bus driver to talk about on Twitter, for example, where he's stopping, where he's going next, how long he's going to be there, or, maybe, take a photo if he's allowed to, and to share, what it's like, being in that soup kitchen. And then you use the organizational account to monitor those individual accounts and retweet what they are saying. So you're using the organizational account to kind of boost the more personal narrative of your staff. And so, yeah, you could have that, use the soup kitchen as an example, but, you can, for example, have that, with people who work, I don't know, like in wash or protection or whatever. Yeah.
Great. And are there any recommended tools or APIs that we can use to display the 0.3% of tweets on our website after a disaster?
Off the top of my head, no. Again, this is something like for the technical side, because I mean, as you can tell, I'm not a developer myself, so I normally then go to developers and say, how can you make this happen? I would also, if it's a disaster, I would again go through something like the Digital Humanitarian Network and just say, like, these are my needs. Of course, there are a few tools. Trying to think. One tool I like a lot is Geophedia, but I'm not sure you can embed that. That's more like for monitoring. If you, I mean, the question means like, how do you get the 0.3%, that were used in this case for OCHA out to your own website? For me, the way I would be doing it is I would then contact whoever has already done the filtering for you. So in this case, it was OCHA. And I would just say like, oh, how can I get access to this, and how can I, put this on my own website, and then you can, figure out with your developers how you access that API. Oh, I see Gordon is just saying this is what you're already doing. Okay, I'm glad that works.
All right. Another question here is, do some communities or countries now have social media response teams ready to deploy and activate to monitor and sift through messages within a short amount of time?
I'm sure there are more than I'm aware of, but I'm just going to share a few examples. And you're saying countries, which implies that it would be the state that's in charge of that. I don't think that's necessarily the case. I think you have, obviously the US, you have a lot of very sophisticated social media monitoring going on there. You have big organizations also spending a lot of money on social media monitoring. So, of course, as NGOs, we sometimes also get these things for free, but I know, things like the New York Emergency Management Center, they definitely do that. Again, I think the Philippines are a good example. There, what has happened for years now was that volunteers went, through Twitter and so forth, and then put what they found into Google spreadsheets, and then people could just, go through the Google spreadsheet, and that way, for example, immediately say like, oh, I'm close to this, I could connect with this person. Now, from a data privacy point of view, I think a lot of countries that would be problematic, because what they posted was, tweets together with, personal information like phone numbers and so forth. But again, this was information that people volunteered. So, there is a balance to be considered between, data protection and privacy and, sharing information so that people can help you. And then, of course, out of that came what I mentioned earlier, those now official hashtags, which will make it easier for everybody, including these volunteers, to find that information. I also know that, for example, in Kenya, the Kenyan Red Cross, they have a big program for like digital volunteers. And I don't exactly know how much monitoring they do, but I know they're doing that. So those are examples that come to my mind spontaneously.
Wonderful. And just, I think we only have time for another question or two, but we have one person who's just asking your preference. When in a disaster, is it preferable to use the hashtag versus the handle? When would one be preferred over the other?
Well, it depends on who you want to reach. The Twitter handle is what you use if you want to address somebody personally. So you want that, the account holder of that handle becomes aware of what you're saying. So for example, if you use my Twitter handle, like the @Timolu, then you would say like, well, for example, have you seen this @Timolu? And then you would, paste the URL to a photo. Then I would see it, but probably nobody else, or very few people, just your followers. Whereas if you use the hashtag, and for example, you would say like, here is a photo of the earthquake in Napa Valley, hashtag Napa Valley earthquake. I don't know what it is then. Then everybody who is monitoring that hashtag would see that tweet. So it's really a question of whether you have a complete question for an organization or a person, or whether it's just an information that you want to go wide.
Great, thank you so much. And we're actually at the end of our webinar, so if for those of you who couldn't get your questions answered or have additional comments, questions, want to share any resources or ask Timo to share some resources, please know that we're going to continue the conversation on our disasterready.org Connect community. And all of you are able to join. You just log into disasterready.org and you click on Connect in the navigation bar, and you'll be able to pose questions, attach files, etc. And Timo will be there this week to moderate the community. So please go there after this webinar and join the community. Timo, I wanted to take a second to thank you so much for an excellent presentation. So
thanks for having me.
Yes, thank you. And so we have another webinar coming up in September, the Emergence of National Disaster Risk Reduction Platforms, and that's with Vasco from the UNDP. And if you would like to register, please do so again on disasterready.org. Timo, thanks again. We'll see you in the community. And everyone else, thank you so much for joining. Yes, have a great day.